Okay. So anyway, this is Casey, or AKA KPikklefield, on Instagram and Twitter, and with me is Roaming Millennial, a political commentary YouTuber, and so I'll let you go ahead and say what you like.
Hi, so first off, thanks for having me on. It's so nice to talk to you. So I have my own channel here on YouTube under Rowing Millennial. I've been making videos for about a year, and I've actually just started being a full-time YouTuber in around February, which is really exciting. I do mainly political and social commentary, anything to do with social justice, feminism, but also since the 2016 election, more and more anything to do with, Trump and things like immigration, stuff like that. So there's definitely a lot of different things happening right now with things like free speech as well. And so I try to cover a variety of topics on my channel.
All right. Yeah, let's talk a little bit I'm curious because I'm so involved with the riots, what's going on, and the free speech stuff around here. I'm curious. I might be in a little bit of a bubble. So, what is your perception, or people that you've talked to, perception of, the Berkeley riots? I know what some mainstream media has said about it, but I'm curious what you've heard or what you think.
Well, yeah, of course, you're in Berkeley, so I think you have one of the best handles on what the situation is down there than anyone else does. But from what I've seen so far, it just seems like anytime there's any sort of pro-Trump or pro-free speech rally, it's interpreted by Antifa as a gathering of bigots and neo-Nazis and fascists, and they of
Uh-huh.
course then show up and just start beating on people. From what I've seen, most of the violence has at least originated with Antifa. Not that there were no one on the other side that's participating, but from anything that I think has been largely reported, it does seem like Antifa has been the catalyst for all of the violence that has happened at these riots.
Yeah, I agree. We've taken a lot of flack for showing up with body armor and things like that, and I guess after a couple of riots and getting attacked and beat on, you kind of know what's going to happen, and you decide, all right, maybe I don't want to get my head busted open.
Mm-hmm.
But like the last riot, the big one on April 15th, I didn't realize how much garbage was being thrown at us, because when you're filming like a fight right in front of you, you don't see everything coming over your head until I watch other people's videos. And there were rocks, bottles, bricks, these homemade M80s falling everywhere. But at no time, I never saw any Trump supporters actually pick up stuff and throw them back. They were just trying to dodge, or they were getting hit, but no one picked up weapons and used against the Antifa, even though I would say they would be justified in doing so. But the news still characterizes as being, like you said, Antifa against extreme right, and everybody who supports Trump is extreme right. And yeah, there was some of that, but I would say a very small percentage of people were on the far right that were there.
Yeah, and that's something that I know. I've done videos about some of the Berkeley riots before, and anytime you go on the site like BuzzFeed or Salon, it does try to paint this as this gathering of alt-right, far-right supporters, and then obviously when you actually look at the accounts of people who actually went, their versions of it, you see that most of the people are actually just probably even some liberals as well, just trying to stand up for things like free speech. So it is interesting how certain parts of the media, the very left-wing media, does try to portray it as this, Antifa versus the alt-right or the far right.
Yeah. In fact, I went to a Sensora Taylor, who's the leader of a Revolutionary Communist Party, and she's also the leader of Refuse Fascism. And I heard she was going to give a talk at UC Berkeley. And so I was curious to see if someone like that, who is advocating the destruction of the police and the government and of capitalism and of America, if she could go and talk freely without bodyguards or police, or if she was going to need the same thing as if a conservative speaker were going to go talk. So I went there, and of course there was no need for security, no problem. She got in, and then no one was allowed to videotape unless you were their appointed liberal, media. I videotaped anyways, but and then afterwards, someone from New York Times interviewed me, and so I did my best to kind of set the record straight as far as what the riots were about or who was there. But yeah, it's still, I think the mainstream media still, whether they believe what they're saying or not, still want to portray it as completely something that it's not, and it's very frustrating.
Hmm. Yeah, I can definitely understand how especially if you're part of that movement, how it would be frustrating to have people assume that you're this neo-Nazi white supremacist or, alt-right person just because Antifa wants to wail on you.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so you went to university just recently, right, or not too long ago?
I graduated about 2.5 years ago.
How have things changed? What's going on now in the universities and between what was going on when you were there?
Well, actually, I've had a pretty interesting experience with university. My first year, I was at University of Southern California. So obviously, a college in California, one of the most liberal places you could possibly be. I was definitely in the minority there. The college Republicans, out of a school of I think 65,000, there were about 10 or 15 of us. But I only
Wow.
spent a year there and then ended up transferring schools for a different program and ended up going somewhere more conservative. But I've got to say, even when I look at what's going on in universities now, as liberal as USC was back when I was there, it still does not even compare to some of the things that are going on. I mean, when I was there, we never had any protests about different speakers. We never, some of these like social justice classes, we never had professors that were being as blatant in the type of narrative that they were trying to push. And
Right.
it's actually pretty scary. And, I have friends now that are actually still in university, and the stories that they tell me, just in terms of even what kind of behavior the other students display toward them, if they ever show any dissenting opinions, it's pretty shocking. And I think we're at a point now where if you are a student who doesn't buy into the social justice narrative, right, not even just right leaning, but you just don't adhere to social justice, right? You could still be
Right.
liberal and believe that you're in a position where there's a very real possibility that you're going to be alienated from your peers. There's a very real possibility you're going to have your grades penalized because of your point of view and things like that. And I think it's just extremely disappointing.
Yeah, it's things have changed just so rapidly.
Mm-hmm.
The mainstream media is talking about this is going to be the summer of rage, and like July 2nd is supposed to be the time when liberals are going to shut down cities and try to cause so much problems that I don't know, they think they can make Trump step down, or I don't know what, but um, people are going into as low as like middle school and talking to the kids and trying to get middle schoolers behind all this and behind liberal agenda. And rather than teaching kids to think for themselves and decide how they feel about something, they're just blatantly telling them, okay, this is how you have to feel. And I think it even probably goes into elementary school. And I think that's just feeding into the whole problem, and it's just going to cause the violence to escalate.
Absolutely. And I think if we look at the kind of, it's really just indoctrination, right? I don't think we can even call it education.
Right.
The way that we teach children history, the way that we're teaching them things like sex education right now, it's pretty much gender indoctrination, right? You're having fifth graders learning about multiple gender identities and non-binary gender identities, things like that. It personally, as a woman, it's just more and more reasons for me to homeschool my kids when I actually have them, because I'm at a point now where I just wouldn't trust the public school system to teach things objectively.
Yeah, I agree. My kids, they went to private school up until, well, my oldest up until eighth grade. Now he goes to a public high school, and my youngest one goes to a public school. But my oldest one, even he has a math teacher who spends a good part of every day just railing against Trump. And of course, no one is going to speak out against him. Being in this area, first of all, he would verbally attack you, and second, you would probably get beat up later at school. So my son is smart enough not to say anything, but I've also been educating them all along about all this stuff, so he knows it's a bunch of garbage. But um, yeah, I think it's terrible what's going on and what's happened to education, and I think it starts right when boys get into kindergarten, and particularly against boys. Did you see the new Rebel Media? Gavin McInnes did a video about education where he had people send in clips from different classrooms and stuff. That's been happening.
No, actually, I haven't seen that yet. That sounds interesting, though.
Yeah, it's a really good one. It's about 38 minutes long, and so he invited people to just send either audio recordings or audio and video of different things that are going on in their classes from schools, I think mostly just in the US. And then he compiled it into like 20 different points. And it was the same thing we're talking about, just teachers or people coming into class and teachers allowing them to espouse, their own basically liberal agenda, and no one, of course, can say anything about it. And that's not education. That's, like you said, it's indoctrination. It's a brainwashing.
And I think we often talk about how this is happening in university, but like you said, it's happening younger and younger. And I think right now it's just education as a whole, academia as a whole. It's been this way to kind of more mold young minds, not into people who are critical thinkers and can judge things for themselves, but really these people who kind of follow the party line and believe everything that they've been told.
Yeah. I don't know if you can hear that, a BART train going by.
A little bit, yeah.
They go by about every 15 minutes. Yeah, it's I just forgot what I was going to say now. But the things Jordan Peterson was talking about, I think he did a video, or maybe it wasn't even him, did a video about a new law in Canada, kind of back to the whole gender thing, and where the backers of the law believe that the state should have the ultimate authority over your children. Did you see that video?
I think so. Yeah, I think so.
And they were talking about basically, like, if your child is confused and decides that he doesn't want to be a boy anymore, and you've basically got to back that, or you can be in trouble. And I think that proponents of that are saying that, well, because of the environment now, kids are coming out and talking about changing genders because they're free to do so. And I don't think that's the case. I think it's because they're getting indoctrinated so young, it's confusing them. And that's why they're coming out and talking about that. And now you've got that legislated, and that's being voted on, in Canada. I don't know what the latest is on that, but, I was shocked when I heard that. But
absolutely. And I think Canada it's so disappointing. So my mom's Canadian, and I was born in Canada, and I've lived there for about probably 5 years non-consecutively throughout my life, and I've always visited a lot. I don't really have enough of a history in Canada to really consider myself a true Canadian.
yeah.
But it is very disappointing to see what's happening culturally in Canada. And I think a lot of Canadians, they have the issue of being so well intentioned that they don't really understand the consequences of what they're doing. Because if you look at something like a lot of the legislation that's going forward, that in the end will end up kind of limiting free speech, they're doing it because they want people to be comfortable in their gender identities, right? They're doing it to help people. They're doing it to make sure that everyone's respected and things like that. They have these noble intentions in their mind, but they don't see how it's increasing totalitarianism and speech policing. And like you said, with children, I think they're coming from a place of they want everybody to be accepted, and they don't understand how if you tell a young child that boy or girl or both or neither, they're trying to breed tolerance, but what they really are is they are confusing the children. Absolutely.
Yeah, they're confusing them, and then they're getting legislation to help the children and to go against parents. And yeah, I would not want the state having anything to do with raising my kids, especially the way the world's going. And I think a lot of what goes down in Canada, the same kind of people, they're trying to do the same thing in the U.S. And if it starts in Canada, it'll move to New York, California, and spread around everywhere else. And
absolutely.
People have talked about, well, maybe in 10 years or something, people that are pushing that agenda in the colleges now, those are the type of people that are going to be our lawyers and judges and senators and congressmen. And I mean, I wonder if it'll get to the point where when those people start to get some power, if they're going to be able to start, actively changing free speech for us in America. I mean, what do you think about that? Is that alarmist or?
No, I think that's absolutely a reasonable thing to be worried about. And as someone I've made a ton of videos about maybe like 5, about gender identity and the fact that no, there are just 2 genders, and
Yeah.
also 2 sexes. Like, that's a fact. And something that a criticism I often get from people is, well, why do you care what pronouns people use? Like, why does it matter to you? Why are you trying to tell people what to do? And it's like, if this were just confined to teenagers on Tumblr trying to be trendy with new pronouns, I wouldn't care so much. But the
Right.
fact is that people are trying to legislate these, right? And so that's why this matters, because this isn't just I want to tell you your gender doesn't exist because I want to be a jerk. No, I want to explain why I'm not going to be calling you Z, and why it's unconstitutional for you to legislate and demand that I do. Right? So that's what I'm worried about. And if we look at somewhere like Canada, where the government does support making it harassment to call someone by not their preferred pronoun, regardless of whether that pronoun is real, regardless of whether that pronoun actually coincides to their actual gender. And it is extremely scary.
Yeah, it's. I think it was Jordan Peterson brought up the point. Someone asked him, "Well, would you still address people with their pronouns even if it wasn't legislated?" And I think he said no, because he didn't feel it was best for them. And I totally get it. If you're some non-binary person going to work, and you have all these demands that people should call you this and call you that, and if your employer goofs up, or a coworker or someone you're interacting with goofs up, I mean, they could be in a lawsuit, and if it's a small business, they could totally lose their livelihood. So it's like, why would you want to bring that into work? I mean, you're making yourself unhireable. I mean, only a fool would hire you and take that risk, if you've got the laws like that on your side. Especially if you're like a lot of people who would love to take advantage of something like that.
Definitely. And as someone who, my mother owns a small business, I understand very well the struggles and challenges that go into running a small business and trying to be successful. There are so many barriers. I can't imagine, on top of that, having to worry about your employees suing you because you didn't refer to them by, Z or Zer or whatever it is.
Yeah, and it's interesting how proponents of that said that they would only take action under like extreme circumstances, but then just before it was even a bill, Jordan Peterson coming out and saying that he was against it, and he started getting threatening letters, and then then of course we all know what happens. After then it's legal, then of course he loses his grants funding and everything, and so obviously the people that are backing it intend to use it to push their own political agenda, and will do pretty much anything that they can do to get away with it. And we definitely don't want that coming over to the U.S., but I think it's here, and I think hate speech, making, I don't know, I have a problem with a lot of laws about hate speech, or even hate speech being even on the books, because it's so misinterpreted, and it's left up to anybody's interpretation. Or I mean, what do you think about the whole hate speech thing? And
Well, yeah, I mean, I've done a few videos about this, and I actually am a free speech absolutist. I think, short of actionable threats, not just, oh, I would, kill you, you type to your friend who's, 500 miles away. No, I'm talking about actionable threats.
What's an example that you would say would be an actionable that shouldn't be said?
Okay, so an actionable threat would be, someone who is in the same room as the person and says, I'm going to punch you in the face, and something like that. I think, that would give us cause to believe that he actually might punch him in the face. And, even there, it's not the speech that we're concerned about. It's that it might lead to an action, right? And, the same thing, yeah, so it's like how planning a bank robbery is illegal, not just because you're planning something, but you're planning something illegal. So I think, that's kind of, as far as I understand, how the U.S. laws has been interpreted surrounding, the First Amendment, right? Like, you can use hyperbole, and that's totally fine. You can say, oh, I'm going to destroy you. Obviously, you're probably not talking about actually destroying someone. Like, that's totally fine. I think only when the threat is actually actionable, when you actually have reason to believe that the person is planning on committing violence, then that becomes a different thing. And, even then it's not so much the speech, but rather the action and intent behind it to cause someone or their property harm. Aside from that, when it comes to things like hate speech, I see no justification for the government to be involved in limiting that. And I think what is very telling is the way that hate speech laws has been interpreted in places like Germany to pretty much just mean anything anti-immigrant or anti-Islamic, right?
Right.
Whether or not it's factually accurate, whether or not you're actually talking about stats that are true regarding, incidents of crime among migrant communities, things like that can be qualified as hate speech. And I think, countries like Canada and countries like the US, we need to look at these countries and what people are being prosecuted for to see how these laws work in action before we even start contemplating doing stuff like that. And if you ask me, it's a slippery slope that we should go nowhere near.
Yeah, I agree. I tend to agree with everything you say on hate, on free speech, and yeah, I think you should be able to say whatever awful mean thing that you want to say. I may not want to listen to it, but I think you should be able to say it, because you start limiting that, and like you said, it's a slippery slope, and pretty soon it's going to go so far as you can't really say anything negative. You can't criticize the government. You can't, but it seems to be where we're going. And I like Milo gave an example one time where if he was walking down the street with like a straight person and someone came up and punched him as opposed to a straight person, they would get charged with a hate crime. And he was like, well, that's not fair. I mean, why am I so special that if he punched my friend, they wouldn't be in so much trouble, but if he punches me, they're in a lot of trouble. It's a hate crime. I mean, that's kind of a form of discrimination. And I don't know, I don't like where any of this is going, and it seems to be going quite rapidly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the case for double standards is an important one, because if you look at what's commonly referred to as hate speech now, it's all, generally anything that's not even, anti, but just critical of
Right.
things like perhaps the crime rate in the Black community, a crime rate among immigrants, things like that. But if you look at actual genuine hate speech that's directed toward, let's say, white people, that never gets any attention. No one's ever been close to being prosecuted for stuff like that. So I think there's definitely a political agenda in terms of who is and who is not being held on charges for this.
Yeah, there is like a huge backlash now against white people. And I was just reading in some professor in Hawaii came out at some university. I don't know what university. I don't remember what she said, but basically she came out and was just a rant against white people. And, I think she might have been the one that was advocating violence towards white people, but some of it basically said, if you're white, you don't belong in any kind of conversation. It can only be handled by, people of color. And it wasn't necessarily a race conversation she was talking about, but basically anything. It's like, okay, now white people have should not be involved in any political or anything anymore. They've lost their opportunity, I guess, or it's just, it's not the extreme left now that's advocating things like that. Now it's, teachers and politicians, and, it's crazy.
And it is scary. And I think, again, it comes from this place in their mind. They're doing it to protect people, right? They don't want anyone's feelings to be hurt. They don't want anyone to be offended. So they just think, let's just make people not able to say these things. They're not even considering the consequences of what it's going to do to our political discourse. We're not going to be able to criticize certain groups of people. We're not going to be able to talk about certain controversial topics. And I think if we go down that road, it's going to, slippery slope again. It's going to lead to some very scary and some very totalitarian policies. And I think if we look at somewhere like Germany right now, we see that's already happening.
Yeah, and I think people don't realize, or maybe, I don't know, they don't care. It's like, okay, say that they get what they want with speech, and then someone's going to come behind them and remove them from power. And then pretty soon what they were advocating, they won't be able to, because now somebody else has the reins, and they open the door and they let them in. And I don't think they realize that, or they don't care about it. They just want to push their agenda. I don't know.
Yeah, it is scary, and I think, what's important to remind these people is like, yeah, it's fine to advocate for these policies now when you're part of the, I guess, mainstream cultural opinion, but what happens when these policies are in place and you're the one who's on the fringe, or you're the one with the less accepted viewpoint, right? Are you going to be so quick to advocate for censorship then?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So let's talk a little bit about what happened in Manchester. And I haven't done anything except tweet about that and read all kinds of stuff about that. But so what's your views on that whole mess?
Right. Well, I've actually just finished filming a video about that. It'll be up tomorrow on my channel. But
Oh,
what one of the things I thought was interesting is like the Westminster attacker, the person who's responsible, I think Abidi is his name. He was
yeah.
actually born in the UK, and so anytime a terrorist attack happens, especially in Europe, we often look at it like, okay, well, how does this relate to the migrant crisis, and does this relate to Europe's pretty much open border policy? And in response to the attacker in this case being born in the UK, a lot of people are saying like, see, no, it's not a problem. Like, border security wouldn't have done anything about this. Shoring up immigration, that wouldn't have helped at all. I've been doing some research into this, and that is just a pile of baloney. If we look at this attacker, he was the son of Libyan refugees, grew up in a very tightly knit Libyan community where first generation migrants include members of the Libyan Islamic Freedom Group, fighting group,
Uh,
sorry, known terrorist group. So he grew up in a community with known terrorist operatives who were first generation migrants. And so this is the environment that he grew up in. And so it's no wonder that he was radicalized. And, I think if we look at the UK as a whole, they have a very large assimilation problem. And the fact that I said this in my video, but if an immigrant comes to a country and the immigrant community there is so large that they don't even need to interact with any locals, and there's no reason for them to assimilate. And that's exactly what's going on in the UK now. And I think, as sad as it is, it's not surprising.
well, I think that's going on in the U.S. If you whatever country you move to from, move to the U.S., even in the Bay Area, there's a Cuban community, there's an Ecuadorian community, there's Japanese, Japantown, Chinatown. There's all these communities where people grow up their whole life never learning English because they just stay in that community. They never assimilate. I think it
Exactly.
used to be. Oh, my screen went blank. Okay, it used to be that you came to the U.S. because you wanted part of or something of what we had, and you tried to adopt the culture. And I don't see that happening. Maybe a small percentage of people, but I don't think that's happening anymore, even in the U.S.
Right, and I totally agree. And I think, something that I saw on Twitter the other day is that immigrants used to come to the US or to the West in general for a change of culture. Right now, they just come for a change of location.
Right.
So many of the immigrants that we see coming in now, they have no desire to actually integrate into American society like we see people doing maybe 50 years ago. And it's part of the reason why we see these giant, sort of ghettos where you can be in the United States but see people, none of whom are speaking English. And as
Yeah.
someone who, my father is Chinese, so I have quite a lot of experience with the Chinese community, in North America, immigrant communities. And I think, they're actually an example of it. They do tend to assimilate quite well, but you also have, tons of older Chinese people, especially who come and still don't speak any English. And, I think that's a problem with Chinese immigrants, that they're not doing enough to assimilate. But at the end of the day, at least they're not blowing people up, right? I mean, this
Right.
this is an even larger problem when we look at a culture that is actively hostile to the West and to Western values.
Yeah. My ex came here from Ecuador, and she learned English within 2 years. She was teaching at a private school and not teaching Spanish, but she was just teaching in English to kids at a
Hmm.
private school in 2 years. And it took a lot of work, but and in her adult education classes or whatever you want to call them, there were people from all different other countries in there, and they were all not trying to just speak their own language, but they were all trying to learn English. There were people from Russia, from China, from Japan, from I don't know, Mexico, everywhere. But yeah, I don't think that's happening anymore.
No.
And that, like you said, it sets up the problem like what happened with the bombing in Manchester. It was so easy for that guy to become radicalized. And I'm
Right.
sure we're going to see that more.
Right. I mean, he was really only raised in the UK by virtue of geography, right? Not by virtue of culture. That, his experience growing up was definitely by no means that of the average Brit. And, I think that assimilation can work, like you said. It is possible, definitely. Of course, it's possible. There are many immigrants who have become productive members of the West, but right now that's not really a criteria that we look at when we're accepting migrants, and it's too bad because there are other immigrants perhaps that would be more willing to assimilate, whose values are more similar to our own. But because we have this policy of, being colorblind, we can't treat anybody different. Nope,
Yeah.
a refugee from Iceland is the same as one from Syria. We can't say they're different, and it really is too bad because it's putting people's lives at stake.
Yeah, right. So, whenever you see something like what happened in Manchester, then you get people coming out and saying, well, it's just a very, very small percentage of people who follow Islam, and that's just an example of, extreme example, and a majority of Muslims don't follow Islam. I don't really buy that. I think a majority of Muslims probably do believe in the Quran, and that's completely full of hate speech. And I just don't see how anybody, at least who follows the Quran, uh, can be in the West, or can I don't know, be compatible with the Western world.
Right? And actually, they've done studies and polls about this. And by and large, British Muslims, even British Muslims who were raised in the UK, still have very different values than other Brits. And they've actually done studies about this. I think it's, something like only 1 in 3 British Muslims would actually report one of their family members or friends if they were suspected of planning a terrorist attack. That is unbelievable. About a quarter of them, I think, want to see Sharia law implemented in the UK. So yes, some Muslims can fit into the West, but they're only compatible to the West insofar as they renounce Islamic fundamentalism and conform to our Western values, right? It is an
Right.
either or type of thing. So the idea that someone can be, embrace all Islamic values, be fully Muslim, and be all right with our Western liberal democracy, that doesn't really make sense. These are two conflicting ideologies.
Yeah, I agree, and I just don't think, I don't know. There's just no way that anybody who follows the Quran or believes anything like that is ever going to be able to be in the West. And when you've got, what, 23% of the world is Muslim, and do you know any kind of numbers as far as the UK, how many are Muslim compared to the rest of the population?
I want to say I think it's somewhere between 4 to 7%, if I remember correctly. It's much higher than it is in the US, but it's still definitely below 10%.
So several of those percent wouldn't care or wouldn't say anything if anybody was planning on doing any kind of a terrorist attack or anything. They would just let it go. So
Hmm.
they're loyal to their religion, to Islam, and loyal to their kind, and completely not loyal to where they're living or where they've supposedly uh, immigrated to.
And it is a huge problem that I think we've in the West been hesitant to address, and that I think by and large most of us don't even understand because we're very secularized in the West. Most people in the States are nominally Christian, but most people aren't religious anymore in the West, and
Yeah.
it's if you're coming from that perspective, it's very hard to imagine an ideology or a mentality where these people would put their faith before the laws of government or things like that. But to these people, this is serious. They believe this is life and death. This is their eternity that they're talking about. So of course they're going to take it seriously. And us Western humanists, secularists, we can't even understand it. And so that's why I think we've been so ineffective at combating it.
Yeah, when I was a teenager, my mom worked for a guy who was an international consulting economist. This was back in the 80s, and he used to travel and talk to different world leaders and about their economic policies, things like that. but he was also kind of a doomsday prepper a little bit back in the 80s. This was during the Cold War, and when we all thought that Russia was going to nuke us and we were going to nuke them. And I never expected to really grow up. I figured when I turned 18, I had to register for the draft. I figured I would end up in some kind of a war with Russia. But, he was saying that I think back then people were thinking that the Catholic religion was going to be a problem and they were going to rise up, and that's what people thought. And he kept telling people, no, it's Islam, Muslims, they're gonna try to rule the world, take over the world. And of course, everybody thought he was crazy back in 1980. And now look what's happening. It's like they are kind of taking over the world through immigration and through just having more kids and just kind of slipping in.
And actually, the thing, you raise a good point with children, and it's not just that they have more kids; they also have kids younger, right? So, while someone in the West might have one kid when they're 30, someone from the Middle East might have, by the time they're 30, they already have three. So like the generation cycle is also shorter. So therefore the growth is exponential. And I think when we look at somewhere like Germany and Sweden right now, I think we are at a point where there's already such a large Muslim population that regardless of whether they actually close the borders at this point, there are so many of them there. And their birth rates are so much higher than the local Swedish rate that, in 100 years, I fully expect Sweden to become a majority Muslim country. And that will, of course, change the culture.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to have to wait 100 years.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, like probably faster.
Yeah, I think in our lifetime, easily. So it seems like Sweden's lost. I know people are saying all of Europe is lost. There's no going back. I was watching a video from. Are you familiar with Britain First?
No.
I'm not real familiar, but I was watching some short, I think Periscope videos. A guy, I think Paul Golding, and he was basically talking about how his country is being stolen from him, and to be same thing as in the U.S. If you're any kind of a nationalist, or if you're patriotic, or you believe in your country first, or anything like that, it's like you're racist, or you're to the extreme right, or whatever. And the same thing, over in Britain, it's like same thing happens there. It's like you can't put your country first. You can't be patriotic. When I was in school, people said the Pledge of Allegiance. I'm not sure when that stopped, but I know my kids don't know that by heart because they never had to say that, and people don't take anything like that seriously anymore. Mm-hmm. It's really sad.
Yeah, I mean, nationalism, patriotism, those have become dirty words in a lot of places, right? I mean, we've gotten to a point now where I think a couple schools have even outlawed wearing, the American flag on a T-shirt because it's offensive. It's like, what? This is the country that you are in. How can that be seen as offensive? It's crazy.
Yeah, that I heard about that. That really makes me angry. Or even other things in schools, like schools have their school pride songs and chants that they do at like sporting events, and some schools are eliminating that because you might make the other team feel bad or feel uncomfortable, or and it's like it's so pathetic. I have a hard time wrapping my mind around that. I just can't believe that's happening.
Mm-hmm. I think just as a culture we've become overly sensitive. And, it's funny that this, I guess, misplaced sense of altruism, because I think a lot of this has been done with good intentions. Like even with immigration policies, we're doing it because we want to help, but this will ultimately lead to our culture's decline and our downfall because we're too afraid to stick up for ourselves.
Yeah, I agree. And by the time people are waking up, but I think that to a large degree, conservatives are still too glued to their computers and tweeting and not getting out there on the street and doing things, whereas you've got liberals who are out in force trying to cause change. And I think unless conservatives go out there and start doing the same thing, we're going to lose our opportunity or chance to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm, definitely. And I think it is kind of the plight of conservatives, right? Conservatives tend to be more focused on, law and order, rule of law, and, not wanting to, I guess, cause too much of a commotion, things like that. And so these kind of movements where the liberals have been out in force, they riots, protests, all of this, conservatives might pen an op-ed on some blog like, this is why I disagree. And part of that is also because conservatives tend to be older. If you look at liberals, they're on average much younger, and so of course they have that kind of revolutionary spirit where they want to make a difference, they want to go out in the streets and stuff like that. And I think that's something that conservatives need to do better with. We need to be more galvanized.
Yeah when I first started videoing the riots and things, I was totally, even though I was on the right, I was totally trying to remain neutral and just film what was going on. And now as I've gotten to know these people and been to 4 or 5 events and filmed 3 riots and watched people that I know get beat up and hurt and hospitalized, and so now I'm going to Portland on the 3rd and 4th, and that's kind of the home for Antifa on the West, and they're putting all their threats out and everything, and I have no idea what it's going to be like, but I'm at the point where I don't know if I can sit and just videotape now. If someone's getting attacked and beat up, I might have to drop my camera and do something. I don't know if I can still remain neutral like that, or if that's even a good thing anymore. I think at some point I won't be able to do that, and that won't be a good thing. If this keeps on going, July 2nd turns out how the liberals think or want it to be, then people who want to remain neutral, who want to be on the sidelines and just watch or document, I don't know if they're going to be able to still or should be doing that anymore if it gets that bad. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I'm personally hoping that all of this doom and gloom this summer doesn't occur. I would like to be optimistic about it, but so far everything we've seen since Trump's election has kind of told us that riots may be the new norm. I think it's pretty upsetting, and I think honestly a lot of the far left people who support these kind of things, they're actually doing a lot more harm to their movement than good, right? Because the average person, I think, is neither super left nor super right. They're more centrist, and I think most people really just care about being able to go to work every day. And when you see all these violent rioting happening, when we see people being barred from going to their work on the highway, things like that, I think it just reflects very negatively on your movement.
Yeah, I think that because Trump is doing well despite everyone fighting against him, and I think because the economy is turning and everything I think is getting better, I think that maybe the liberals are looking at this summer as, okay, this is our one chance to be dramatic to get him out, and if we don't do it this summer, we're probably going to lose it, and we'll probably get him for 8 years.
Mm-hmm. And what's funny is that I'm one of those people that thinks, heck, even if Trump is impeached, then Pence becomes president, even better, right? So I don't really know what their end goal is, just to sort of, I guess, disrupt the system, which is too bad, because I feel like a lot of people are putting, their ideology before the actual well-being of the country.
Yeah, I agree. If they did get out Trump, well, they're going to have to get out Pence. I mean, where do they stop? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't see how they could have thought it through.
Yeah, I mean, Pence gets out, then you have Ryan. Is that better? How many people are you going to try to remove undemocratically before you're happy?
Yeah, I don't know. So, do you think that, or what do you think the likelihood that things that's happening in Europe with, with the terror stuff, obviously our borders aren't as porous or haven't been as porous as over there, but, I still got to think that there's a lot of extremists that are probably have been living here for many years and are just kind of quiet, maybe, and biding their time. What do you think?
Well, I think it goes to show us that we can never be too vigilant about stuff like this. And, I was just looking, about for the video that I filmed, I think this is the 13th terrorist attack in Western Europe since 2015. Over 300 people have died. And we look at the comparative stats in the United States since 2001, September 11th, there's only been less than or about 100 deaths over those 16 years. So the rates of attack in Europe and the US are drastically different. And like you said, I think it does speak to the fact that the US has had much tighter immigration control, especially when it comes to migrants from the Middle East. But that, of course, none of that is to say that the U.S. is completely safe. We know that's not true. Terror attacks still happen. But I think we can't let political correctness stand in the way of protecting our citizens, right? I mean, things like programs that have been proven to be effective, like monitoring and surveilling mosques that have been reported for extremism, those types of measures actually work. They're not politically correct. They're not popular with a lot of people, but it's what we need to do to actually combat this problem.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm not really sure how far this is going to go, but I feel for my kids in the country that that I'm leaving to them. I just don't. I have a hard time seeing that even with Trump being in office, even if he maybe if he does survive 8 years and he doesn't get thrown out or removed or assassinated or whatever, it's only eight years. I have a hard time being positive going forwards for my kids. Given what's going on, we're a little bit isolated in the U.S. We're not experiencing the same problems, but if the rest of the world falls around us, how long can we stand? I know I saw your video on pro-family, and I really like that video. I know you got a lot of MGTOWs going on there and doing their garbage and things like that, but I found it refreshing that you're still positive about family and marriage, and I'm wondering how, given everything that's going on, how you remain positive about that.
Well, I think all of this really has to do with personal experience, right? I think my interpretation of marriage and family is so positive because I have two amazing parents who've been together for about 30 years now, still going strong, and I've all of my personal relationships as well, like they've all been super positive. I've just surrounded myself with really great guys who I think anyone would be lucky to be with. And I think the flip side of that is I think a lot of these MGTOWs or a lot of these, I've also gotten a lot of heat from these feminist types. Their experiences I think have been negative, right? Like they've been hurt, they've been I guess in maybe unhealthy relationships that have kind of changed the way they view things. And I think honestly this is the issue with families and things, like it is something that we need to change on a societal level. I think as a society, as a culture, we need to kind of make marriage fashionable again. We need to make marriage cool again. We need to stop all of these attacks on marriage that I think when it comes to like the media and popular culture, Hollywood, it's just kind of nonstop. I think we need to stop that because it's it's kind of the mentality that people are brought up with. But also on an individual level, we need to make smarter choices and more healthier choices for ourselves, which I think a lot of young people aren't doing. And if you so many of these comments about marriage, you mentioned my video there, marriage doesn't really benefit me, why would I want to get married? And like, I'm sorry, but that's clearly someone who hasn't really had that healthy relationship, that productive relationship where you want to promise yourself to this other person so you can be a family for the rest of your lives, right? I mean, because coming from a background where I actually, until I was in I think 5th grade and I moved back to Canada, I had never met any kids that had divorced parents. Growing up in Asia, it's just not something that's very prominent in the culture. And so, of course, my perspective of marriage is going to be very different from someone whose parents got divorced. Maybe they've been divorced and stuff like that. So it is a matter of perspective. But I think the people who are completely delegitimizing marriage are being perhaps overly negative about it based on their own experiences.
Yeah, my parents have been together for, I think next summer will be 50 years, I believe. Yeah, it's their 50th. Yeah, wedding anniversary. No, 60th. No, 60th. Wow. Yeah. So, and they're both their sides of the family. They were all together for until they died, and so I've had really good role models. But I agree. I think probably the people that are most vocal complaining about your video probably didn't have good role models, and probably for themselves have not had good relationships, whether it's been with wives or girlfriends or
right.
whatever.
And actually, I've looked into the statistics regarding marriage quite a bit, and whether your parents have stayed together or not is actually a pretty good predictor of how your own marriage will work out. So I think it is interesting, and I think our perception of marriage, how we view relationships, definitely affects how ours turn out.
So why is it, do you think, that Asian cultures, people tend to stay together or to stay married longer and don't get divorced? Is it much more difficult, that process, to get married and to get divorced? Or is it just too easy here?
I think, it's funny. I've had people talk about marriage like, oh, people who stay together in marriage, it's just because it's too hard to leave each other. And I think that right there shows the different mentality toward marriage, right? Because marriage isn't this thing where you say like, okay, we're together now, and then if I want to divorce you, it'll be more difficult. Like, you shouldn't go into marriage thinking about divorce. When
Right.
when you get married to someone, you're making a commitment like, hey, we're family now, right? We're gonna build our lives together, we're in this together, like, we're always going to be on each other's team. And that is very much the mentality in Asian cultures. And we even see that, with how Asian families are with their extended family. It's very common for Asian parents to move in with their kids when they get older, right? When their children are adult. And it's, just that concept of the family unit as this kind of this unbreakable bond where you're in this together, and these are the people you depend on, these are the people you rely on, these are the people that you spend your life with. That's the kind of way that marriage is approached, and has nothing to do with if divorce is hard or anything like that. It's just because you don't want to divorce, right? You're in this because you chose to be in this. And I think that view of marriage is something that has been lost in a lot of ways in the West. We kind of see marriage as like, oh, well, I like you now, so I'll be with you so long as, nothing really changes too much and I still feel like it, stuff like that. It's kind of just an extension of being a boyfriend at this point.
Right. As long as you've got that safety valve and thinking that if it doesn't work out, I can get divorced, then how committed can you be?
Right.
I don't know.
Exactly.
But then, I'm divorced, so I'm probably not a good person to be talking about this. But and then as far as, totally aside from marriage, but as far as kids, going into the future and having kids, I think you have to have a pretty positive worldview to believe that you're going to leave the world fine for them when you're gone. And that's what I struggle with. A couple of years ago, I was totally, before I got red pilled, I was totally out of politics. I hated everything to do with politics and just kind of had my blinders on. And after watching a few videos and watching Jordan Peterson's videos, and then I finally woke up, and for the sake of my kids, I'm glad I did, and I'm glad I got involved politically. But part of that getting involved, now I'm seeing what's going on with the world, and I don't like it, and I don't know that things are going to get much better. So I don't know, how do you must feel that there's not as much doom and gloom as a lot of people think, I guess.
Right, definitely. I mean, I've had people say, how could you bring children to this awful world? And my response has just been, where are you from? I mean, there are things going on politically that I don't like, but I think overall, the world, we are probably the most fortunate people to have ever lived at this point. We have the highest standard of living that we've ever seen. So, in the West, we are so unbelievably lucky to live where and when we do.
Yeah.
And I think, these people who say, oh, I don't want to bring a child into this world because it's so awful. I mean, so is your solution to have us all just kind of like die a slow death of attrition, where we all just stop reproducing and mating and the human race? Like, what's the end goal to that kind of thinking? If we don't like it, do we just give up? Like, all right, well, human species, like, no, we're out. I'm unhappy politically with how things are going, so let's just stop. That's not a very healthy mentality or attitude. I want to raise my children with good values, and I want them to be positive forces in the world so they can continue to move things in the right direction.
Exactly. I think that's important. As thinking that your kids can be, make a change and can be a positive force. And I think that's the way you've got to look at it. And I think that's a really healthy way to look at it. Definitely. I wanted to touch on, I watched your interview with, I can't now, it's Richard Spencer.
Yeah, Richard Spencer.
And, for the first part of that, I thought, maybe I have this guy a little wrong. And then of course, when he got into the re-immigration, or basically sending everybody back to their own countries, then I'm like, okay, yeah, I don't have him pegged wrong.
Yeah.
But what struck me as interesting, and maybe I'm wrong, is you seem to get a lot more hate about the vegan stuff than with your interview with Richard Spencer, and that seems backwards. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, definitely. And the thing is, I've done videos about different militant groups, right? I've done videos about Islam. I've done videos about feminists. I've done videos about social justice warriors. Videos about the alt-right. These are all very militant groups in their own ways, but the most militant of them by far were the vegans. Definitely. I've never gotten so many death and rape threats.
Yeah, I have a hard time believing that. I know, you caught some hate about the Richard Spencer thing, and I totally understand, your style of interviewing. If you would have gone after him, he would have shut up and you'd have never gotten anything out of him. So I think you did it the right way, and I like how you do your interviews. But I just, the hate you're getting from the vegans, I think, is just completely crazy and out of proportion.
Right, definitely. And it's pretty funny because I think the vegan population in the US is something like 1%, and 85% of vegetarians, and I think it's like 75% of vegans don't end up staying vegetarian or vegan, right? Like, this is very much this niche fringe fad that we have in the West, and yet they are some of the most militant people and violent people that I've ever encountered. And that's including Islam, right? Like, keep in mind, I mean, there's no vegan bombers, but just on average, the amount of vitriol that they spew is just incomparable.
Yeah, it's a good thing they haven't gone the way of IEDs and things like that, because they certainly have the right attitude for it.
Yeah, seriously. I'm pretty sure that if they didn't lack such severe protein deficiencies, they might actually be able to get up their strength to accomplish that. But no, I'm just kidding.
It's funny. I was walking downtown Berkeley, and I came across there was this guy in this cardboard box laying. He had like shorts on, but he was laying in this cardboard box thing that was supposed to indicate like a meat package, and he had the plastic wrapping and fake blood all over the place. And so I thought, this is gonna be interesting, so I started videoing, and I asked the guys what was going on, and basically they were vegans and trying to tell me that animals' lives were equally important. And he went on in a spiel about it. It's like a 2-minute clip on my website, but on my YouTube channel. But one of the things he said was that we're guilty of raping cows to produce milk. And I thought, man, what kind of milk have you been drinking all your life?
Yeah, and
I don't get how that works.
That's the thing. I got so many vegans saying, you're putting like feelings over facts because you're not vegan. I'm like, what? You guys are the most emotional group that I've ever dealt with. I mean, like, inseminating a cow is not the same as raping a cow. And like, what about fish? Do we rape fish? I don't think it's possible to rape a fish, right? Yeah, but I actually think I have to go pretty.
Oh yeah. No worries.
But yes.
Any parting shots, anything that you want to say, plug your channels, anything like that before you go?
Sure. So if anyone is interested in checking out my videos, it's Roaming Millennial here on YouTube. I'm also on Instagram at Roaming Millennial, and on Twitter. I pretty much live there lately. It's where I get into fights with vegans, social justice warriors, and all that. It's at Roaming Mil, M-I-L, just the one L. And yeah, I think that's it. Thank you so much for having me.